Hi, I'm Liz Hamson. I'm the editor of Property Week, and I'm delighted that you can join us for our In Conversation with Dentons partner Deepa Deb to discuss where we've got to with the great reinvention of retail. Looking back over the past few months, we've all been witness to the noticeable resurgence of confidence in the retail sector as COVID restrictions have been lifted. Technology played a key role during the pandemic, and now it's set to play an even greater role as we emerge from it. However, the sector faces a host of fresh challenges, including Russia's war on Ukraine, which is driving up gas and wheat prices, not to mention inflation, labour shortages, and the ending of the evictions moratorium. Meanwhile, retailers and landlords are under mounting pressure to make their operations more environmentally friendly, as the ESG movement continues to gather momentum, for now. Calls for the government to ditch its net zero agenda to focus on other priorities are getting ever louder. So what needs to be done to ensure the retail recovery doesn't stall? How should we be reimagining retail for the brave new post-COVID world? What does tomorrow's high street look like? Today, Deepa and I will be discussing all these questions and more as we explore how to rev up the retail recovery to make the sector fit for a post-COVID future. Deepa, as people venture out shopping once more, they're encountering a very different retail environment to the one they encountered in early 2020. There are self-checkouts everywhere. Experience is coming to the fore, though not necessarily retail-oriented. Think more yoga and cooking classes. Vacant space is starting to be put to innovative new uses. What pandemic innovations do you think will endure over the next few years?
Thanks very much, Liz. If I was going to pick a few trends, I would probably focus on the demand for same-day retail delivery, as well as the implementation of digital tools in on-site shops, such as virtual reality, augmented reality, shopping experiences, as you said, checkout-free stores, metaverse, and all sorts of social commerce. And I guess social commerce is the other aspect I'd like to focus on, which is the use of, for example, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, that retailers are now doing in order to, as a new form of marketing. Also, I think we've seen the use of AI and technologies to personalize recommendations for customer needs. All ways in which to attract that Generation Z clientele, use of visual searches, and essentially we're looking at omni-channel tools to create more meaningful shopping experiences.
Tell me a bit more about the metaverse. Everybody's talking about it. What impact do you think that's going to have in retail?
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? Metaverse, which I have to say is a completely new concept for a Luddite like me. This sort of, 3D virtual worlds focused on social connection. It's sort of science fiction meets shopping. And we are seeing some real examples of this. For example, we'll come on to it, I'm sure, Liz, when we talk about who are doing things well and, what are the trends to look out for. It's taking your everyday shopping experience, but infusing a 3D, a sort of ability for you to try before you buy, if you like.
Yeah, I'm quite sort of terrified. I think I'm also fairly Luddite on that score, and I'm not sure I want to live in a virtual world. I quite like the real physical world, but it's coming, isn't it? What about, you mentioned self-scanning, obviously Amazon Go, we now have that. I was in it was in France recently, and I noticed there were a lot of click and collect supermarket outlets. So there were really tiny spaces actually where people were simply going presumably to collect their grocery shopping. What more do we expect to see on that front, do you think?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Liz, and I think that we're going to see much more of an infusion of the sort of digital technology spurred experience coming into bricks and mortar retail, because from a retailer's perspective, what the retailers need to do is they need to think of ways of enticing us away from our screens, out of our homes and into the bricks and mortar shops. Hence, you're seeing, more of this sort of reliance on experiences to get us out there. So, in terms of trends that I can see continuing to be accelerated, one of the biggest ones we're seeing at the moment is the way retailers are using these social media platforms, if you like, to not only market their products and services, but also to tap into a whole new group of consumers. So, for example, the use of Instagram, Facebook, TikTok as a means of selling. But equally, we're also seeing that these interactive retail experiences are bridging the gap between online and offline parts of a store, opening up a whole new way to get these different platforms interacting. So, you're absolutely right. We're going to see much more use of technology to make that retail experience easy for us all. But the other trend I think we're going to continue to see is the partnership between retailers and other industries. For example, you can see mixed use concepts like restaurants selling branded merchandise, just by way of one example. And I think we're going to also continue to see retailers investing in their local communities, wanting to partner with our other local businesses. Again, all as a means of enticing us into the bricks and mortar stores.
And all enabled by technology. And all enabled by technology, really, in a way that we've not seen before. Are there any pieces of technology that you don't think will stick, or any pandemic trends that you don't think will stick and were just for the purposes of the pandemic, if you like?
Well, I think it's a really difficult one to answer at this stage because although I suppose in the UK we like to think ourselves as being post-pandemic. The reality is there is still a level of fear in communities, and we are seeing numbers rising, and so there is still a reticence amongst a lot of us to be in among the crowds. So I think that the truth is when we last had this discussion, Liz, we discussed the fact that e-commerce had already really challenged the way traditional retail functioned, and those changes were just accelerated by the pandemic. So I think what we're now going to see is actually that sort of period where we're all adjusting to this new normal, where we all know the convenience of being able to sit at home and shop for pretty much whatever we like, but it's a question of whether we actually want to continue to do that, whether actually we're finding that we're missing something, and actually how the retailers respond to that. And we talked a little bit about retailers responding with virtual reality, augmented reality, that sort of type experience. The question is, how much more of that are we going to see, and how much of that are we actually going to respond to in terms of our changed habits now?
You make such a good point, and it's going back to that piece earlier that you mentioned about experience, and how that is now being delivered in a much more multi-platform way. So there's the physical retail experience, but there's also this social media enabled experience as well. And I think it's really interesting to see how that all plays out. Recently, we covered in the international issue, we profiled a scheme in Lille, and it was Redevco's redevelopment of a Galerie Lafayette. And they've got all sorts of other elements in other than retail. In fact, retail makes up quite a small part of the overall mix. So they've got a Citadium, which is quite a trendy street brand, which is the retail focused piece. There's Decathlon there, there's a hotel, there's an escape room, there's a climbing wall, there's I think there's flexible workspace there, and there's a really significant sort of street food offer that's over 2 floors and pretty much, and it's actually bigger in fact than the retail offer. So I'm wondering whether you think that sort of format, that very diverse mixed use format, is the way forward, particularly for things like department stores and the reinvention of the department store.
Yes, absolutely, Liz. And again, you and I have been discussing this for some time, haven't we? The requirement for traditional retail to be repurposed, but actually how that doesn't sit in isolation from the wider piece. We've seen the sort of statistical evidence to suggest that actually if we can create vibrant communities where you're encouraging people to come in and work, encouraging people to come and live, actually what that does is increase footfall, which inevitably will lead to people coming to shop and use your leisure facilities. And we've got some really fantastic examples of that, haven't we, in our own good city of London, for example. I was in Wembley yesterday for Mother's Day. And when you look at what's been done in Wembley, not just with the residential, but the flexible office, you've got the concept of the box that sits in between all of that. So, you've got family entertainment, you've got eateries, you've got shopping, you've got homes, you've got flexible offices, all within, this sort of like square mile. And, again, if you look at what's been done by Argent at King's Cross, really clever. What's happened is you've created, offices, industry, you've complemented that with homes, and then you put the kind of the retail and the leisure experience and the F&B around it. And we can see that is really successful, and these are really, really becoming destinations that people want to spend time in.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head there. It is that word destination, isn't it? And with retail alone, the concept of destination retail locations has pretty much died, hasn't it? It has to be this mixed use piece, and to your point earlier, it has to be community focused. So, you've talked about a couple of schemes there that you're impressed by. What do you see? What about the sort of provinces, smaller towns? You've talked about some highly urban locations there. What is the future for those shopping centres in out of town locations, in non sort of city locations? Well, what do you think is coming for those locations?
Yeah, I interestingly, I think those locations are going to be more challenged, and the challenge is going to come on a number of different fronts. Firstly, household expenditure, cost of living. We're all aware as to how much that's rising, and one of the biggest rising costs for all of us is the cost of petrol, diesel. Obviously, as you touched on, Liz, not helped at all by the current crisis in Ukraine. But the reality is that, as shoppers now, we're having to think about whether we want to drive out to, for example, for somebody who lives in London, Lakeside or Bluewater. Do you really want to drive out there, pay the cost of your petrol, pay the cost of parking, just so you can do your shop, when actually there are places much more locally that you could travel to by bus or tube, and actually you could then have your shopping delivered back to you, so you're not having to haul it all with you, because the big shopping centres are offering that as a service. Will you actually drive out of town? So partly it's the cost of petrol, but there's also the ESG agenda. We're all very aware of our carbon footprints, and should we all be getting into cars to drive out? Certainly that new generation Z shopper is not going to want to go and shop somewhere that it means that they're increasing their footprint. So I think those out of town retail centres are challenged because of the decisions that is going to impose upon us as shoppers, in terms of having to get into a car, drive, when these are all things that are currently being actively discouraged in various ways by the government.
Of course, if you're living or working in those locations, then maybe that is another solution. So workspace, it seems to me that there's a lot of redundant retail space out there that could be converted. And the other big piece that I guess we saw the beginning of maybe a decade ago was the introduction of greater element of residential. At that point, it seemed to be mostly for sale residential, or sort of quite low grade stuff bolted on top of and next to supermarket retail space, because the supermarkets were downsizing, weren't they, what they required. It's changed, hasn't it, recently? We're now hearing about the likes of John Lewis thinking about BTR. I think that's been reported on. What sort of role do you think BTR could play in this reinvention of the high street?
A really key role. We still have a housing crisis in the UK, Liz. We all need places to live. And if anything, our requirement for homes is almost more important post-pandemic than it was pre. Most of us have become hybrid workers. Most of us are still working from home, and that seems to be a permanent trend, in that it would seem that nobody is keen to go back to the office 5 days a week. And I know it depends on industry, but the reality is people's homes are becoming more important, and we know that we don't have enough homes. So, those traditional retailers that already have access to land, BTR seems a bit of a no-brainer in terms of strategy, because they've already, of course, passed the hardest hurdle, which is they've got the land. So then it's a question of them thinking about whether they want to go for the affordable housing end, the mid-market end, or the high end of the BTR product that's available, rather than whether they should or should not be doing it. And certainly at Dentons, we're currently working with some of the significant UK retailers who are considering just that, which is, BTR is a bit of a no-brainer, but it's a question of which bit of the BTR market they want to aim for. And certainly I can confirm that from the discussions I had recently at MIPIM, I was really interested that there was a lot of talk around how much longer the logistics bubble will be sustained because of some of the challenges with logistics generally, but also some of the inflation in those margins and returns. But the one theme that came across quite strongly at MIPIM for me this year was the clear recognition that residential, in terms of homes, remains a very sound sector for investment.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think there possibly is a role for some urban logistics in some of this redundant space, if it's, if it can be used in that way. But you're right, the longer and perhaps bigger opportunity is in the residential space. Interesting that you mentioned that they're making the decision at the moment, retailers, of whether to go sort of high, middle or low. I presume that's location determined. So if they're in a more affluent area, they would look to a sort of higher end product.
Yeah, completely. So, there are retailers who've got, big stores or even, rundown shopping centres in areas that are very easy to commute from. And so you can see why you might want to go for at least mid-market in those locations. And equally for those retailers that have got stores dotted around the country where, we're looking to, we're seeing trends in the office sector around creating these flexible office hubs. You can see that lending itself more to the affordable market. I think the higher end, in terms of BTR and Resi remains still quite challenged in terms of being able to get over the viability hurdles. But certainly I would have thought that, and certainly from the retailers we're speaking to at Dentons, it would seem that sort of mid-market and affordable for the retailers feels like the right direction of travel.
And I guess whatever proposition you go with, that still speaks to that wider, it has to be a mixed use kind of context, doesn't it? So what about the other types of use that could come into some of this redundant space? We've talked a bit about flexible workspace. What about the things you find in every community, or should find in every community, like medical centres, libraries? I mean, do you think we'll see some of those, if you like, old-fashioned uses, or more, certainly not seen in every now sort of shopping centre use, coming back into the shopping centre space?
100%, and in fact we're already seeing it now, Liz. The amount of time I spend in a particular shopping centre, is outstanding, really. And this is a shopping centre that actually does provide services like a dentist, a dental surgeon, a doctor's surgery, a pharmacy from which you can pick up your prescriptions, as well as a library. So I think you're absolutely right. It goes back to what we were discussing earlier around the need to create vibrant communities and how that vibrant community can then lead to not only your services but also your products being consumed and being bought, and the requirement to therefore partner. So I think you're absolutely right. I think we're going to see that trend towards mixed use and other services continue. We're already seeing it now. Interestingly, one of the landlords that we're currently working with at Dentons had a really novel idea about offering alternative services to its tenants rather than relying purely on rental income for space. So, for example, this particular landlord has a sustainable building which is mixed use, and actually they're looking to offer their retail tenants services such as energy supply renewables, as well as, traditional things like a concierge and use of flexible office space, obviously at a modest additional cost. But again, keeping that additional cost modest in order to attract that tenant to their building, which again I thought was an interesting trend and an interesting evolution of the landlord-tenant relationship, going from that traditional I've got space and you're going to pay me rent for it, to much more of a collaborative, yes, you're going to pay me rent for my space, but what else can I do to attract you to my space? What else can I offer you?
Yeah, and it would be good to actually see that sort of collaboration coming to the fore, wouldn't it? Because that relationship has been quite fraught for a couple of years now, for obvious reasons. Hasn't been helped by the evictions moratorium, which came to an end very recently. So I think anything that can bring that relationship and forge a stronger relationship between the two is going to be positive going forward. What about the scope for collaboration on the ESG front? You alluded to how important that was to people earlier. What do you see coming through from the landlord-tenant perspective on how they can sort of promote ESG credentials?
Well, this is a headwind that's not obviously unique to retail. It's a huge agenda item because actually, landlords are feeling the pressure from every angle in terms of complying with the sustainability agenda. You're not going to get funding for your building unless it's sustainable, and that is clear. But equally now, you're not going to be able to attract the right occupiers unless, again, you're able to demonstrate your sustainability credentials. And, as we were talking about that new generation of shopper, we've seen that, that actually they prioritize the kind of social and environmental value to the way in which they shop. And we've seen the recent scandals over some of the pure online provision with their supply chains and how they've been boycotted by that young generation of shopper. So I think there's a lot of pressure for landlords and owners and developers to ensure that they are getting that sustainability right, not just in terms of their supply chains, but actually in terms of the buildings that they're building. But at this stage, how to collaborate on that remains a little bit open because we don't yet have industry standards as to what one should aspire to. There are various different levels that one could go to, but there isn't yet a set established standard that you could build to and know that you're secure and know that you can tick off your funding, you can tick off your occupiers. But I see the ESG agenda in retail being really more of a pressure point to drive decision making rather than something that will be collaborative.
And that's the thing, isn't it? The consumers are putting the pressure on, but the pressure's coming from all sorts of sources, isn't it? So let's just look ahead, let's say, to the next 3 years. What do you hope to see happen on the high street and in these old redundant department stores and in big shopping centres? And what do you expect to see?
Key challenges do remain for the retail sector, Liz. Supply chain delays, the requirement to remain competitive against larger big box stores, the problems with managing operating expenses, the cost of rising inflation, which is affecting all our businesses. In terms of what we think the future looks like, we think that we're looking at retailers as platforms. Shoppers want to interact with retail brands that offer convenient experiences. We see the connection of business ecosystems, the creation of a network of companies that are connected by data, products and services that are going to evolve and respond in response to this demand, focusing on minimising the number of steps a person needs to take to get to the products they need. Platforms that connect businesses and ecosystems with consumers will continue to deliver results because they integrate a range of products and services into a centralised location. So instead of bouncing around from website to website, shoppers can manage multiple needs in one place, with a retailer or a brand becoming the go-to destination for both owned products and ancillary services. The other trend I think we're going to see is the importance of data. Brands that are going to look to strengthen their first-party data collection So they establish direct consent-based relationships with consumers who create a wealth of owned data to position retailers to be able to create their own media platforms, partnering directly with suppliers or other brands to deliver highly personalized communications with, across owned channels. These relationships will be inherently symbiotic, with partners and retailers exchanging direct insights on targeted audiences, ultimately strengthening their first-party data over time, with retailers benefiting from new revenue through data monetization. The other trend we'll see is social media selling, from chatbots to text message checkout links. Retailers connecting customers everywhere. They want to shop using technology to automate operations, opening up more time for the retailers to invest in marketing, design, and new business ideas. And finally, Liz, as we've discussed, the retail store of the future, it's all about human experiences driven by digital. For nearly 2 years, retailers have faced COVID-19 lockdowns and restrictions, with e-commerce changing consumer expectations and the role of physical stores and online channels. The desire to return to physical retail can be seen across the world, and particularly in the UK. So as we've touched on earlier, retailers need to start being inventive to think about ways in which to draw us away from our screens and out of our homes.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's interesting to see that the QR code has finally come into its own after being talked about as the future for a long time now, really. So clearly there are some huge opportunities for the sector, but nothing less than a radical reimagining is required. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Thanks, Deepa, for sharing your thoughts on the future of retail. I'm sure everyone watching will agree you provided some fascinating insights into the future, and the not-so-distant future at that, judging by all the innovation we're already seeing. Thanks very much for your time, Deepa.